Flying troops. They exist in every single RPG game, and their special attributes that they can only be hit by a certain amount of long-range units. But if you look very closely, you'll see that there isn't a single one in Clash Mini. And trust me, there is a good reason for it. So today I'm gonna tell you why Clash Mini cannot just add flying troops the way that you're probably thinking, and how I would implement the flying troops in a way that I personally believe that it is the way to do it. So let's go. Let's start with the core problem of the flying troops. They can only be hit by long-ranged units. And that is a big problem because in Clash Mini, you don't have one guaranteed troop that can hit air troops like in Clash Royale. So if the enemy doesn't have a single ranged unit that can hit flying troops, they would lose immediately because their ground troops would do nothing. That would mean that every single deck from that moment it would need at least one ranged unit in order to counter the flying troops and one flying troop in order to be extremely cancer and to have free wins in case the enemy doesn't have ranged units. Some of you could say, okay, what if instead of being always flying, they would fly every X amount of attacks? Remember the Royal Ghost when he was absolutely crazy? He would just completely carry the team because he could attack so fast, and it would just lead to so many unfair situations. Some of you might say, let's make it dodge. Do you remember the Goblin Synergy Dark era where you just missed 4 attacks? I don't want that. Okay, so let's nerf the flying troops slightly. Well, that will not work because if the enemy had a 6 flying troop deck and you have something like this, you are done. One ranger or long range unit, it would just not be enough. Nerf even more flying troops. Then you with the flying troops would face a deck with 5 ranged units. You are gonna lose immediately. It would just be so hard to balance things out. Or you might be like this guy, I'm not gonna pronounce that, and say that a ground unit, if it's the last one standing, it should hit air troops. Does that make sense? Imagine that you're the last man on Earth and out of nowhere you can just attack a dragon 1,000 miles away with your 1mm sword. That just doesn't make sense. And this is just why flying troops are way much more complex than you think. They cannot just be added out of nowhere like in Clash Royale. They are a bit trickier than that. And now let's talk about how I would implement the flying troops into the game. And I just want to start by saying that I got my inspiration from Battleboxer. Yes, but more specifically, his third ability, Ascend. A very interesting word, and that gave me the idea, what if from time to time the flying troops, while all of the other characters were just fighting, what if the flying machine, for example, could just ascend to a different fields and it could still shoot the ground troops? In that field you would only be targeted by air troops, and after a while you would go down back to the normal field. And you would repeat this another time in the match. And this would be a very interesting mechanic. But now you're thinking, wait a second, that is way too broken. Hear me out. To start off, flyer passive. Let's get it clear. Start the game on fly mode, where you can only be targeted by air troops, and this would last 5 seconds. Not too much time that you can just place the flying troop right at the front line and be safe. No, you need to be strategic because when it would go down, it would just die. And it's not way too little time because after another 15 seconds they would go back to the fly modes. And yes, this does not mean that they would still be flying at frenzy time. In frenzy time they would stay right on the floor. But then you might be saying, okay, they on the floor would be very weak, but on the sky they would be very strong. No, let's just rebalance its stats, make it slightly weak, but while they are on the floor, kinda how Battleboxer works. After ascending, Battleboxer gains rage, and the flying troops could have this same mechanic. While they are on the floor, they would gain some special attributes. Rage is a very simple way of saying things, but they would gain some sort of special attribute that would not make them completely useless on land. Now let's just talk about some final details about the flying mechanic, because it's still a bit more complex than that. It would take half a second to go into the fly mode, and it would take half a second to go back to the land. So this would mean that because this clock of the duration, it would start as soon as you start flying, and you'd still have the invulnerability while you're going back to the land. This would mean that you'd have an effective 5.5 seconds of immortality, but only 4.5 seconds of free damage into the ground floor units. And these would make it not completely busted, but a little more safer. So with this in mind, you could make its HP slightly weaker, so it will not be completely broken. Now, I would give the example of the flying machine because it's honestly one of my favorite troops of Clash Royale, and it would be a 4 elixir, and it would have 12 HP and plus 7 HP for each upgrade for a 4 elixir. Yes, but remember that it would be flying, so it would be a balanced amount. Attack speed and damage don't really matter too much. What I will suggest it is the super. Imagine that the flying machine would have somehow a super like Skeleton King's Wand, and when it would go back to land, even though the flying machine it is a ranged unit, what if it had the special attributes of gaining energy while receiving damage? It would be a 6 energy cost, and while flying and while in the backline, it wouldn't be effective at all. But while on the front lines, it would be so effective to make it safe. It is just a solid idea. I just also want to say that obviously if you're talking about other flying troops like Minions, for example, Balloon, Baby Dragon, obviously they would need a completely different treatment from the flying machine. But the core idea is that the flying troops, they will be less HP because they can go into sort of immortality on the different fields, but they would have some sort of defensive buff. That's kind of where I'm going with. They would have some sort of defensive capability to not make him horrible on lands. The only downside of this way of implementing air troops that I can personally see, it is flying troops against flying troops would be a bit more complicated, but I still feel like this is the way to go. If you have any different idea, or if you have actually some sort of suggestion to complement what I just said, say in the comments down below. Trust me, I will read them. And I'll see you on the next video.